This morning, you want to tell them what we're doing this morning? Tell them the outline of what we're doing this morning.
We're co-preaching.
Yes.
And full disclosure, I requested these chairs because I don't want our height difference to be a distraction.
I didn't think it was that big a deal.
Because you're taller.
Yes, but you're smarter. And I said this. I go, you get either height or intelligence. And I got height. I was young. I didn't know. But this morning is our annual meeting, and so we want to do kind of a little bit of our service this morning is talking about CLC. We were gonna pause our prayer series, but it kind of overlays with what we need to do with this last week on prayer. So I'm going to try our best as we go through kind of the state of the union of CLC of our church family to overlay, prayer. And if that doesn't work, I apologize in advance. There will be food afterwards. So you can think of that as like, Eric wasn't good, but the food was delicious, and those two balance themselves out. Yeah. So we'll do this time, and then the board is going to come up and do communion, and then we're going to officially start our meeting. So that's what we'll be doing. Yeah, today. So before we go anywhere, let's just review from last week. Pastor Ben was speaking on prayer, and we talked about listening prayer. Our extra credit last week was the idea of Lectio Divina. How do we listen to God? And this is one of the things we do. We ask God, we tell Him what we're doing. Jesus over and over. Remember, we talks about asking Him, and then we go to listening to God. And so for some of us, this will be new ground of trying to listen to God. And so last week Ben really challenged us. So part of Lectio Divina is breathing, it's silence, it's reading Scripture, rereading it, meditating on it. And sometimes we get these different thoughts from God. Our world's busy, and by stopping and placing time aside to listen to God, sometimes we have to quiet that noise enough. So that was our homework for last night. We're not gonna do a quiz, but next week bring your number 2 pencils. We will, yeah. So as we go through our time, we're thinking about prayer, how prayer shapes us and it molds us. Sitting in a chair preaching is just not. I need to move around, Sylvia. I know. I feel like a caged animal. Yes. Yes. I know. Okay. So, but let me just remind you. Of the things, as we talk about the church, I want to remind you, and the encouraging thing when we come to prayer, some of the things, here's reminders we've talked about. God gives us words when we don't have them. Pray Scripture. We have thousands of years of brothers and sisters who have loved God, who have shaped things where you go, wow, that's really helpful. We have all these mentors in different centuries. And they fought hard. They went through hard things, and we get to benefit from how they clinged on to God. So sometimes God will give us the words. The one thing I think as Christians, and one of our talks over this last month, is Jesus keeps saying to us, ask. Like, well, Jesus, you don't do that. Ask. In fact, his illustration is ask even in an audacious way. And so sometimes we're like, well, I don't know if God would do that. Did you ask Him? Well, no, I just figured. No, you figured wrong. Jesus' words were ask. And then the other part, which is really important, is that God in prayer wants us to bring us the hardest things in our life, the things that worry us, that break our hearts. And that is, again, almost 70% of the Psalms are those hard things. And to have a really close relationship with God, God wants to come in and take the hard things in our life. He doesn't say, figure it out and then come to me. He goes, no, come to me and let me work with you. And that's where sometimes for us, these are the game changers. James, consider it joy when you go through various trials, because this is where God goes, this is where I'd be most with you. This is where we'll experience it the most. So whatever it is, small or big, we all go through those things. And I think the most important thing as we go through today is this. We must believe that prayer makes a difference in what happens, what does or does not happen. It's not There's a lot of theology that goes, everything is baked. We're just along for the ride, you know? You've been to Disneyland, you get in, you're going on the ride, whether you like it or not, you know? But that is not how Jesus faced it. That's not how his followers have faced it. Is that any time we call to God, God, we need this to change. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're always trying to shape the world towards what God wants to do, not towards what you want to do or I want to do. We'd all be on spreadsheets if we did it that way. But the idea is that we have to really believe that God is active and he wants to change things. And when we pray with that in mind, our prayers become different. You have to give yourself over to hope. And so today when we're going to be covering how do we, this next level, it's to listen, to talk to God, to talk with God, right? To listen to God. But there's this other place where is being with God. What's it like just to be with God? And we're going to talk a little bit about that and why that'll be important for us as we go forward, and especially this year as we look to fill really key leadership positions. Worship pastor, maybe our next lead pastor. That we need to be listening to God and have that place where we're actually with God, so we have peace even when sometimes things don't make sense. So we want to talk about past, present, and future. So Sylvia, take us through your thoughts.
We'll start with the past, and thank you for the invitation for the board to participate in this important sermon series. As part of the board of directors, we spent time thinking about a little bit about the past and then the present, and more importantly, the future. So. And when you think about the things to do in the past, in the present and in the future, a lot of times we fall back on our own experience. So for me, I started going to CLC back in 1999. So it's been about 26 years. 26 years seems like a long time, but not when you go to a church that has been around for 103 years. So if I, as a leader, rely and be informed by my own journey and experience, just purely in the past 26 years, I'm not leading in an effective way. So when I realized that, then I go, well, if you look at all the posters, they're also on the website, we have documented history of the last 103 years. So what I did was I went back to it and tried to glean any information that I could and see whether we can draw any lessons to learn for this particular part, like this particular season for CLC. And I found some good stuff to share. So the big question is, in this season of change, what can we learn from 103 years? So quick quiz, no prizes. What do you think these dots are? And there are 5 of them altogether. Priscilla, very good, you're correct. So this is the documented congregation size.
It's really not fair. She's in marketing. It's really not a fair.
Yeah.
She probably should let,
So don't answer more questions.
No.
So this is like documented congregation size by year for CLC. So I want to quickly go through these 5 dots and kind of like telling you the history of CLC. So we start on the left because that's way in the past, right? So dot A, that's 1922 when CLC started. So that was 103 years ago. At that time, we had a congregation of 14 people made up by 7 EC adults, and there's 7 Nisei children. So Issei is first generation Japanese American, Nisei is second generation Japanese American. So we started with 14 people. So moving on to dot B, that's in the late 1930s. And that's when CLC was going through a pretty vibrant church life. We had about 25 families all together, and we had adults, about 30 to 40 of them, and the Nisei Sunday School, we had about 50 to 60 children altogether. So the whole church, I know, the number of children per family is just a lot different back then. So we had a total congregation about 100 people. So that was back in 1930s. Then when you look at .C, that's like 50 years later. So we're talking specifically about 1983. At that time, it's an important chapter of CLC. When you think about 50 years later, I mean, basically, the Nisei children back then, they are now the old people, right? So they, in terms of the congregation size, it went all the way down to 35. And it was mainly the Issei who were still around and some of their Nisei offspring. Many of the Nisei who are now older, they left and went elsewhere with their own children. So there was, we went all the way down to 35, but it was also the year, July 1983, that's when Pastor Wayne Obimachi joined us. He was hired as the lead pastor for CLC. So when you look at the dot all the way high up there, dot D, that's in 1999. So that's when I came here to join CLC. So I was new to the country, went to this awesome church that had like 400 people. So just to give you an idea how vibrant it was, I joined a home group led by Yan, and it was, we didn't meet there. That's another story, another day. But so I joined the home group when it was freshly multiplied, and before the multiplication, before they split, they had 3 dozen young adults in that group. So and now .E is where we are now. So 2025, and we have probably around 120 people on our roster. So I'm telling you this like really quick overview of the church history, and there are points to it. So if we go to the next slide, so we do a little bit more analysis. So we group we take the 4 dots out, and then we group the last 2 together, and then the first 2 together. You can see that what we are experiencing now, it has happened before at CLC. So right now we are the second group. We dropped from a peak of 400 all the way down to 120 right now, right? So this is a real and reasonable concern for us, But if you look at the other set of data, we also have similar things that happen in terms of the congregation size for both set of data. The congregation size reduced by about 2/3 from its peak. And if you look around, and both congregation, the demographic are all also of the older adults. So there's that similarity, but there's also another similarity. Go back to the last one, thank you. So I want to point out, not just the congregation size that we've had similar experience, we also have similar experience in terms of things that happened to us. For both periods of time, we had experience where there was a break in meeting in person. So if you look at the yellow line on the left, that was 1942 to 1945. That was during the Second World War. Our congregations, our members, were uprooted and they were sent to internment camps. So they were sent to 2 camps in California and the other one in Idaho. They could not meet physically as CLC together, but they continued to meet there for 3 years with other Christians. So that's one trial that I wanted to point out. And for us, the other yellow line on the right, that's 2020 to 2022, we all experienced it. That was the pandemic. We couldn't meet in person, and thank goodness for technology, we were able to meet virtually online. So I want to highlight these because sometimes, when we think about our current season, we think about there are a lot of leadership changes and a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties, and it's scary. People may feel that, get wrapped around and feel sorry for ourselves and stuff like that, right? But this is not competition. But when you think about the long history for CLC, the founding members had it worse. They were at a war, they faced injustice, discrimination, they were sent to internment camps. And yet, let's go to the next slide. What happened? Somehow, it dwindled all the way down to 35. CLC, with God, we were able to turn it around. So the lesson here is really study what happened during that time. What made the difference? And how can we learn from that and apply to where we are now?
Yeah. And the other part here, as just as a pastor at church, like we also have, there's all these other trends going on, right? We had mainline churches, and so part of Pastor Wayne was caught up by this whole other, right? Everybody embraced, and now we're all the church, right? All the churches are in, almost every church is in this same thing over the last 20 years. Great growth in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, and then the pandemic really, the reason why we're in this church right now is because this church did not survive. It was really common. Now, I'm not thankful for that, but this is these trends are also bigger trends and national trends. Now, when we go through the past, it's really important. God always calls us to remember the past. In fact, the children of Israel, all through Scripture, what you would find is that every time God did something or there was something in place, and we have a lot of those within CLC's history, and is that they would put up stones. They would mark the area as an altar to always remember God did this here and God did this here. So the focus was always on what is God doing. God also purposely allowed sometimes things to dwindle down for His reasons. I mean, one of the big emphases of the Old Testament is the Exodus. They have Exodus theology, that God is moving the children of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. And in that, God says, I'm going to let this whole generation go until I can raise a new one up, because they're not believing me. I was going to give them the land, but they didn't believe me. They still are in Egypt in their hearts, even though they've left it. And so the history of remembering what God did was always primary. And in fact, it's interesting, in the Old Testament, we have God referring to Himself by, I am the God of Isaac, of Jacob, and of Abraham. So He refers to Himself of what He did to these, to these people, to this tribe at that time. Always looking back. So remember what I did for them? Yes, that's the God that I am. I want you to remember that within the context of relationship and what I did. And so as we now move and say, and I feel really hopeful and optimistic, honestly, because I feel like when God moved us here, it's like, okay, now I have this building, and I feel like, Father, how are we going to fill it up? We got this little property. How do we fill this? What will you do here now that you've moved us here? And He said, I'm not doing anything till you get rid of that carpet. And this is what I'm trying to tell. I'm like, I know. He's like, I don't, it's an Old Testament, it's like unclean. It's like an Old Testament principle. Like the Father's like, I cannot enter into this is holy ground. And, God's like, take your shoes off. But He's like, for us, He goes, not on this carpet. Do not take your shoes off. But in that, it's really simple to look back and say, Pastor Wayne came, and he really carved out a place for the next generation. And to say, okay, we just need to go find that kind of dynamic leader. And that's usually not how that. It seems like it's the most straightforward way, but it's really not the way that God usually will work. He uses great people, but He usually loves when a people are going that way, not just the person. You know this. If you are thinking about marriage and you just go, I need to find the right person, you're like, okay, you're in for a disaster. That's not, you're not going to find the right person. You're going to put a list together, and that list is going to be terrible. And when you find the right person, you're going to look and go, look at that. They hardly match anything on my list, right? But the idea is that when we're looking for that, it's incredibly, and it's kind of low-key selfish, right? We're looking for this person to do these things for us. Even though aspirationally it can be, we really want God to come in and work. And so what usually we would say, right, if I look at my daughters, I would say, don't look for the right, boy, because they're, 24 and 25. I would say, and I call, no offense, I call those people boys right now. But I would say, no, be the right person. And I think that's part of what God is calling us to. How do we not look for the right person, but as a congregation, how do we be the right people? And so it's really, and when we're the right people, then all of a sudden that leader finds us. And there's a lot of people that could come in and lead that sort of congregation, right? You could make 100 sports analogies out of it. But there's something about when we're talking about prayer, is that I believe that prayer is the catalyst for us becoming the right people. Prayer softens our hearts. It recalibrates us and refocuses us, on God. When Jesus was talking, and he's talking about the kingdom, that God wanted to do this new work, and we had a new relationship with him, he used, here's Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. It says, Jesus told them, he told them in another parable, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it was worked all the way through the dough. And he's really talking about a catalyst. He says a small group, and I believe this about prayer, a small group of us praying and asking God will infect all of us. Right? Sometimes it's just 10% of the people that go, I feel like God is calling us to this, that the rest of us knuckleheads will go, okay, that sounds pretty good. But so this is what we not only want out of our leaders, we want it out of everyone following, that we infect each other. We're catalytic. So prayer has that ability to be catalytic. And so this idea, this next step with God is just being with God. It's that idea that as we're praying and asking God, we also, in our lives, we also want to develop, and there's this other place of prayer that many of us have experienced with other relationships, and that's just being together. Right? I've taken 2 road trips with my oldest daughter. One, I moved her out right before Thanksgiving from Nashville out to L.A. And then this week, she came up. I think I've shared this with some of you. My mother has gone into hospice, and my daughter's car went down, so we took one car down, and I towed her broken down car back to my trusted mechanic, because mechanics in LA are Dodger fans. I can't trust any of those people. And but who can you be alone with in silence and feel totally comfortable with? In fact, they add to your peace. God says that's the level of intimacy. And maybe you have had that. And my daughter, right? I have friends in my life. Maybe you have that. God says that's what this next level of being with God is. It's spending time with Him. So when we've talked about doing Sabbath, it's not a hard and fast rule that we're establishing the law. It's carving out time to spend time to talk with God, to clear out the schedule so there's no distraction, but also trying to take time, right, where you not only delight in God, but you just spend time with Him and you reflect. And we find that then that all of a sudden anxiety, the things you worry about, leave you. So there is this other level. It's nothing like, oh, you must master it. Snatch the pebble from my hand. No, it's not that we don't keep asking God. It's not like we don't keep praying, but there is a place where God will do that. And so it's kind of one of the thoughts in this is one of the measures of spiritual maturity is our ability in being with God. And what I find is the people that listen to God have this ability not just to spend time with Him and tell Him, which is they do that, but they also have this place where they carve out time where they could just be with God. Even in a place where you see things happening and you literally will be like, okay, Father, are you doing this? Just in circumstances. And for me, as I've told you, working with the homeless in San Francisco, I'd walk down the street, I'd talk to somebody, and it would almost be like this peace with God. I'd be like, wait, do you want me to spend the day with him? And I would feel like Jesus going, yeah, you're tracking with me. I'm like, oh, okay. Because you have that with sometimes your spouse, with your kids. Like, you can look across the room if you're a parent and look at, we know this look from our parents when they look at you and you're like, oh no. Like, I'm not going to say anything, but I need you to do this now. Or you look at somebody and you just could read, right? That's the kind of relationship that God says, that's part of prayer. I want you to be with me. I hurt my knee one time. I had this experience. It's dumb. I hurt my knee. I had to have it operated on. I had to have it scoped. And it was 4 days before I had to get on a plane to go back and surprise my friend. His wife set up this elaborate trip to one of the best golf courses in America. And he just got on a plane. We all met him there because he's a huge golfer. And when I got on the plane, they go, it's a full flight. And I am tall and the seats are small. And I literally am like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? My knee is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to survive it. And I got on the plane and I'm in the aisle and they fill up the plane and there's one empty seat in the plane. And it's the one to my right. And I was able to stretch my leg out for the whole time on the flight. And so this is totally selfish, self-absorbed, narcissistic of me. But when it happened, and they closed it, and me and the guy that were sitting next to me looked at each other, we're like, do we get the one seat? And I thought, wait, Father, did you do this? He's like, yeah, you're an idiot. I'm going to give you this one, okay? But but you have this ongoing intimacy with God where you're just being with him, and then when things happen, you feel like, wait a minute, Father, are you doing this? Do you want me to help this person? And like I say, sometimes we have this within our most intimate relationships. We can look at people, the glance, you go, I know where you're going with this. And so this is what this next level of spiritual maturity is. And the one thing I would say is this. I say that because all along your chart, there were people at CLC. Yeah, your little graph here. That all along that chart, there were people at CLC that were listening to God in this way. Right? Of those 30 people, of the 80 families that left, they were listening to God in a certain way. Yeah. And that's why that's always like, that is like the direction comes from God, even at times when it doesn't make sense to us. But then there is this other place where you go, but I know what he's calling me to do. Right?
So I want to hone in on one particular individual back in the day, back in 1983. And we're talking about the leadership at that time. So most of you guys know Jimmy Coide, our beloved senior, who was a long-time member of CLC, passed away in his 90s back in 2022. So when Pastor Wayne was hired in 1983, Jimmy was actually on the board for CLC. So with Pastor Wayne being a pretty young pastor in a small church with more older people, he actually came with a lot of radical ideas, right? So he came and he introduced new concepts. So we used to, at that time, we were meeting back in Berkeley on Ward Street. He go, let's make a second service. So the second service ended up being in a different location, not far from here, on a Saturday afternoon, the Lord's Gate. So he introduced also contemporary music and casual dress code. I'm talking about 40 years ago. You could wear shorts to go to service. So it's a little bit unheard of, a little bit different. Yes, Frank, you are smiling because you wear flip-flops and shorts to service every week, right? It's a privilege. So Pastor Wayne was also One thing I want to add is that Pastor Wayne did not come, like he's from Southern California. Whether he's a Dodger fan, I don't know. But he came up not because he wanted to be hired by CLC. He came up to start a chapter for WACF. WACF at that time did not have any presence up in Northern California. So he came up to do that. And because of that, he brought a lot of Cal students to CLC. And that's when the attendance went up. So when he had that idea of the Lord's Gate, not everyone was on board, including Jimmy. Jimmy did not like the idea. He thought it was too radical. He was outside of his comfort zone. He was not for it. And he was on board. So what did he do? He didn't abandon ship and leave. What he did was, because he is someone with God, he prayed and he yielded to the majority. So he said, this is not something I like, but most of you guys want to give it a try, let's give it a try. So he did that, and I thought it was a tremendous humble posture for him to do that. And a while later, he went to the Lord's Gate and he saw the fruits and the vibrancy. He considered that he was wrong and he owned up to it. So I think the lesson from this wonderful leader in the past is that, we're in this season of change. We don't know who we're going to have, but there's a very good chance this person is different from what we currently have and what we are comfortable with. There are certain things that we won't compromise, things like biblical truth and stuff like that. We are not going to compromise. But there are things like flip-flops, right? They just might be relative to time and relative to preference. So have an open mind, have an open posture, and to just understand that we just need to be facing God and hear what He has to tell us.
Yeah, and so my question on this one for us is really like, hey, how can we be like Jimmy? Where we're connected to God, but we don't know this next season what it'll bring us. But we first and foremost, we trust what God is doing more than we trust our instincts. And in the church, we do have a habit. I used to work with a friend of mine who's brilliant, John Ortberg. And John used to say, we watch God do something, and then we basically work hard to replicate it. And then we kind of canonize it and idolize it. Meanwhile, God keeps moving on. Right? And so prayer is our ability, through prayer, that's the ability for us to stay listening to God rather than listening to, well, I like this or I like that. And we do see that when Pastor Wade came, from the tradition of what we did and what church felt like. So we don't know what that's going to be. What if it's not even a service? What's a totally different type of leader? Or what if God calls us to a very young type of leader that we need to mentor but still take their cues? We have no idea what that might look like. But I do know this is that this idea of listening to God, that contemplative prayer. Let me just explain a little more of what that looks like, and it's a little esoteric. So Christians have used this. So there's all these liturgical names for it: listening prayer, contemplative prayer. But contemplative prayer is basically to contemplate God's deep character, and with our minds and our hearts, is to gaze into His majesty and into His beauty. So if you think about it that way, now we don't. It says no one can see God, but we just take time to instead of thinking, God, what do you want from me, or what do I want from you, to say, God, look how wonderful how beautiful you are. Look at all the things you do. And so when I was talking, like Pastor Ben goes, he uses music. I have also music that allows me to get into a place in worship where I go, Father, look at all you've done. I recount my past a lot. Look how faithful you were here, here, and here. Look what you've done here. Look how many prayers you have answered. I've never gone without anything. And all of a sudden, this deep appreciation and love for the Father comes, and His voice gets louder, and my dumbness goes down a notch and then 2 notches, you know. And but there's something about this contemplative prayer. In 2 Corinthians, it reads this way. When Paul is talking about connecting with God, he says this: Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Think about that. So how do we pray? Getting into the Father so that there is more freedom in our lives. Right? I hope in your relationship with God, you don't feel like I've got to please God. In faith, God says, you're my child, I love you. Nothing can separate you from my love. He goes, you have freedom to be with me. I better do this. No, he goes, just be with me. Then it says this: and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory. We contemplate the Lord's glory. We are being transformed into his image in ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, which is the Spirit. And so it's that idea that you gaze at the Lord and then you feel him looking back. It's like I look at God in love and he looks back at me, and you kind of feel that, wait a minute, God overwhelmingly loves me. If you have ever dated and been in love, sometimes you get that, right? And if you're not in love, it's sickening to watch, but you know exactly what's happening. I love you and you love me, right? It's that idea, and you don't have to say anything. It's just those couples that look at each other like, are you guys going to do anything? No, we just want to be together. But it also happens like when you're like as a mom and a dad. It's just with children when they're born. Like you get them and you look at them and you love them, and in every little reaction, you just gaze at them in love, and you're just overwhelmed. And God goes, this is actually the type of prayer. Just be with me and understand how much I love you in this deep way. There is this level. Let me tell you, so with my mom, she's home. All of our family has been coming in to spend time with her. So my beloved nephew, who always used to grab my daughters, he's about 8 or 9 years older, when they were young, and take them. He'd just come over like as a high school student, college student. He'd be like, hey, can I just take them for the day? And he would just take them. Beautiful. So now he has 3 little kids. And so yesterday, my 2 daughters are holding his youngest one, Penelope. How's that? And I just caught them. And this is what I was like, oh my gosh, this is what they're doing. They did this for 45 minutes, just looking at her. And she doesn't talk. She barely gurgles, right? And it was just them. And my daughter, Kate, who's holding them, she's the daughter that says, I don't want to have children. And I have a handful of other pictures of her kissing her and nuzzling her. And they haven't spent any time with her. Not like, oh, this is their child. They just flew in from Colorado. And here they are, just beholding her and loving her. And it's to be that God says, this is a place. And I know this sounds, it's a little esoteric, but this is, the more of us that do this with the Father, that we have this place of feeling his love, then the risk that we feel as a congregation, individually in a congregation, they start to melt away. I have God's love. Yeah, right? It's the safety we feel as small children with our parents. The world can be going away, but mom and dad, I'm holding your hand, right? Or when the child goes off, you ever see little kids when they wander off and then they run back and they grab onto the leg that's home base, and then they take off, they do their little, building that confidence. This is part of what that prayer is, so that the Father wants. So, and we find rest when we do this. We have a lament. We come to God and we sit with him, and all of a sudden the pain in our life, it gets mitigated. Okay, God gives us a bigger story. Sometimes the hard things we need to go through, we go, okay, Father, I'll do it your way, even though I don't know how to do this, but I feel your peace. So instead of me going my way, part of that prayer is us going. And so this is for us individually, but it's really for us as a congregation. As many of us try this and just experiment, literally a minute or 2, 5 minutes, really, you're an all-star, you make it to the, but just trying this. God, do you love me? Going through that is amazing. But allowing yourself to look at God and have him look back at you and to start to experience that. So what's our future? If we
So the last part of our sermon is about the future.
Yeah.
So end of last year, we did this survey and asked people different 10 questions, and we got really good results. And the number one priority that everyone agreed on was to make sure that we increase our congregation size and bring down the average age for the people here. So I think one of the things that we all agree on is we cannot stay on the course that we are on right now. If we stay on the course that we're on right now, congregation size is going to over time reduce until it's not sustainable. So for us to reach the younger generation, we need someone who can relate to them, who can meet their needs, who can, it's relatable to them, right? So this is no offense to our current pastors, no offense, but they're not the ones. So they're not the ones who are going to reach the younger generation. I mean, they are great for me, for my peers. We totally understand it, right? So
what are you trying to say?
I already said what I tried to say. So I'll give you an example. So I'm not like, but I'll give you an example. So you guys know those videos that I've been making in the last few years for different occasions and stuff like that? Those chalkboard, like it's a combination of chalkboard animation plus voiceover from Yan and my kids, right? You know what? Those that I was talking about. So the last one that I did was for Pastor Calvin's retirement, and I worked really, really, really hard on it because he has served CLC so well, and I wanted to really honor him the right way. And most of you guys loved it, and for a while, I really thought I was talented in making this until God came around and popped the bubble. So what did God say to me? Well, God didn't say it to me, but I found out from school kids and young adults that they actually found the video to be, and I quote them, cringy. and they said, cringy, totally authoritative, unauthentic. So then you kind of just go, it hurts, So, but after I calmed down, then I realized, that's what God wanted to teach me this past summer. So God didn't want me to get on the internet and search the phrase generation gap, right, and read about it. He actually wanted me to experience it, to really learn it and feel it. So that's what I mean that you're not the one.
So you're saying I'm cringe? Is that what you're? I
made it very clear. Someone else said it, obviously. But yeah. So I think
this is not the way I thought this was going. I did not think our time together. This is not in your notes.
So the lesson I learned is that we ourselves actually know very little.
Yeah.
And God is the only one who can bring the right person to us. Yeah. We need to pray more to align with Him and just trust that in His timing He's going to provide us with someone. But in the meantime, we can pray and we can also prepare ourselves to be the right people for the right person to come and lead us in the future.
Yeah. And this is Jesus talking to the established religious tradition. He said it this way. No one can sew a patch on an unshrunken cloth in an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making it tear even worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. He says, if they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No one pours new wine into, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And what that means is that almost everybody had wine back in the day. It wasn't as alcoholic powerful as ours was, but it was the way to purify water, if you would. And so there was a number of different types of wine, but what they would do is they would pour it into a wineskin that was usually made out of animal, like bladders or things like that, and then it would ferment as it fermented, not over years like we do or even months, over weeks, that bladder would expand. And then as it was used, it would get old and it would get brittle. So if you poured new wine and it expanded into an old one, it would burst and the whole thing would be. So back then, everybody exactly knew what this meant. Fortunately, we don't have that. But it really is that. But the picture was of what is God doing? God is going to do a new work. So it's almost top down, right? That he's always going to say he's going to do something new, and it's going to be a completely new way of understanding and doing things. And it was what God was doing what Jesus was doing with the kingdom. And it's what the church has done for centuries. It's reinvented itself, right? Our fancy word is Reformation. Literally every 500 years, the church goes through a Reformation. Our last one was the Protestant Reformation, and it was 510 years ago, or almost 508 years ago. Martin Luther nailed his, theses to the Wittenberg door. So actually, our church, when we're doing this, we're not just going through what's next, new wineskin. I think there's an exciting opportunity that God might actually be recalibrating not just us, but a lot of things within our Christian faith. And so there are maybe some really great opportunities, for us. And so, as we, come to the end of it, when we've talked about, prayer, I would say this is that as a pastor, and if you ever want to talk about this, I'll bore you to death with it. When Pastor Wayne came, they were a generation behind. We are now not just one generation behind. I would argue that we're probably 2 to 3 generations behind. And most of the churches in Western churches are that way. We're relating in a way that works with our generation, but not the next one and the next one. Those have been, so the changes will, right, if there are changes in how we relate to God and how we do church and how we help people grow in their faith, might feel and look completely differently. We don't know what that'll be. If we knew, I'd write a book and I'd be on tour. But I love the way, as we come to communion, I love the way that C.S. Lewis put it in the Chronicles of Narnia, in the book. Prince Caspian says this: Aslan, who's the Christ figure, says to the kids, "Why didn't you come to me for help?" And then she responds, "I'm sorry, why didn't you come and save us like last time?" And Aslan, who's again the Christ figure, says, "Things never happen the same way twice." I think C.S. Lewis captures this kind of biblical principle. Every time God works, he's so creative in every generation being different, is that he works in a very different way. And so trying to do the same thing we did before, right, even though it's noble and we want to maybe put our hearts to the spirit of that, is that as we look at our church, is to say, hey, if we're a couple generations behind, God, we don't know what it is, but we're praying and we'd love you to come visit us. And in this spirit to say, but we're going to ask. And we're going to ask you, who is it? What is it? What do we need to do? And it's going to be scary, because there's a really cool thing, right, that we take our college students and our young adults and we, right, go, here are the keys to the car. And they go, we want you to drive. We need you to drive it. We need you to inform us. And we will do anything, right, as cringy old people that we can do. And this is why Jesus came. Because when you come down to it, here's Jesus' words. And he's at this moment in history with his disciples. And he says to them, can we bring up the next slide? I'm sorry. I'm going to skip that. That's our extra credit. I'll go back to it later. Okay. Jesus says he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you." Jesus, his broken body at communion, we celebrate that Jesus dies in our place. And then he says this, Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise, the cup after they had eaten, saying, this is the cup that is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood. The new covenant, the new way of relating. And so Jesus, in the same way at that moment in history, looks at his disciples who end up, right, you can go from there, everything about the world in that point changes. But it's the new way of relating to God. So God is always interested. He's right? He loves people. He loves the world. And it's going to be expressed. It's easy for us to think, yes, if I go to a tribe in Irian Jaya, I need to relate to them differently, right? And so within our own Bay Area, we have to think, we want to think the same way. And it always comes from the Spirit. So as we do communion this morning, really quick, I would like to call the board would like to serve communion this morning to you. So I have the board come up, and what they're going to do is